everyone, and welcome back to the Sher Vancouver podcast. We're so happy to have you back. Today we'll be talking about HIV. Our intention with this episode is to build awareness, break down any stigmas, and just start a dialogue. To do that, we have Sameer here with us. He is the president of Vancouver Friends for Life Society, a holistic wellness center that provides many services to help people who have to face the challenges of HIV and other serious illnesses. So, welcome, Sameer.
Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. Let's jump right into it. Can you talk about Vancouver Friends for Life Society and the peer support programs that the organization provides?
Absolutely, I'd love to. So we're actually about to celebrate our 30th anniversary. Vancouver Friends for Life was founded in 1993 out of a pair of apartments on Beach Avenue in Vancouver. Since then, we have moved into a beautiful heritage home, and we're founded on this premise that people should not have to deal with the challenges of a diagnosis of a life-interrupting illness by themselves. And so, starting from those very humble beginnings, we've expanded. We provide peer supports and discussion groups, a nutrition program, counseling services, workshops, massage therapy, art therapy, yoga classes. The list just keeps going on. And if it is something that sort of fills gaps left by the healthcare system that enhances a person's quality of life, we're either doing it or we're trying to.
Amazing. And are these free of charge to folks that are part of the organization or that have signed up, or is there fees?
These services are all provided 100% free of charge. We never want financial ability to become a barrier to accessing services. So many of our services are provided free of charge by volunteers, and we also do fundraising and hunt for government grants as well to make sure that we're able to keep the lights on and our program running free of charge for anybody who needs them.
Great. That's so awesome.
Yeah,
That's
thanks for
very good.
sharing that. That's a lot of services, and it sounds like a very fun, inclusive, safe space to be at.
Absolutely. I mean, we really try to meet people where they are. So when you're in that space, you're safe. It doesn't matter what sort of medical condition you have. It doesn't matter what your ethnicity is, what your gender is, what your gender identity or expression is. Does not matter. We take people as they are, and we expect everyone to treat people with love, kindness, and respect.
Love it. There is a lot of common misconceptions about who gets HIV. So can we jump right into who's susceptible to getting HIV, and what are the common misconceptions about it, especially on how HIV is transmitted?
So I think you're absolutely right. There is stigma that's driven by misconceptions about who gets HIV and how it's transmitted. And I think the most important thing to start with is that anybody is susceptible to getting HIV. It is not divine punishment for the wicked.
Yeah.
And that is so important. It's also viewed as largely being a disease afflicting gay men or men who have sex with men. Yeah. But the reality is that women and girls account for 53% of people who have HIV and 49% of new transmissions. So this really is something that can affect anybody, and it truly does. So I would say that that's number one. Another main misconception is that HIV is a death sentence. That may well have been true back in the 1980s and the 1990s, but it's not the case anymore. It certainly doesn't have to be. With treatments that exist now, HIV is a manageable chronic condition that is relatively easily treated for the most part, with some pretty reasonable medical interventions. So, when you consider that, that's really important. And the last thing I would say in terms of misconceptions about the virus itself is that it can destroy your ability to have a family life. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter whether you were assigned male or female at birth. If you're in the former category, you can absolutely have a kid. And there's things that can be done in terms of making sure that process is safe. If you are carrying a child, again, there are interventions that say you're totally fine to get pregnant without passing the virus on to your baby. So the biggest misconceptions are that this can and will be utterly life-changing, and that opportunities that were open are gone. That's not true anymore.
Yeah, that's so great that like we've come to that point now.
Yeah, I think just jumping back to what you had said, like the biggest misconception is like like you said, if you get HIV, it's like a death sentence, but it's not. Like people who are living with HIV can have a family, can be intimate with their partners, and because of the advances in medication, I think that was something that we also learned, like, wow, even in the 21st century, like there's so much that people don't know about HIV, and that's also the reason why we're here. So I know we're a little later going to get into the advances in medications and how you can live your life, but we do want to touch on the struggles that does come with when we were doing our research in terms of traveling, in terms of, living with other family members in the South Asian community. Are there any, like you said there's peer supports. Can you maybe talk more about how Friends for Life Society helps with the mental health well-being of people living with HIV? Because there's so much around there.
Yeah, I mean, I think for many people things get easier over time, but especially with an HIV diagnosis, you've got a lot of questions swirling around. And what I would say, by the way, our public health system actually does fairly well is providing some initial counseling so that you understand what the diagnosis is, but also what it isn't. Within Friends for Life, our counseling services that, again, we provide free of charge from registered clinical counselors, as well as our stress and anxiety workshops, those two things put together from a professional standpoint, I think are both great tools. And then the peer support's just being able to have a conversation with somebody who's been there.
Yeah.
Somebody who has probably had to ask themselves the same questions that you might be asking yourself. So there's a lot of comfort, I would say, from being able to talk to somebody who has walked the same road that you're walking now.
Yeah.
U equals U, undetectable equals untransmittable. Can you talk about this campaign and how you guys have these advances in medication that's changed the experiences of living with HIV for queer people?
Sure, this is going to be a bit of a long answer.
That's okay.
So buckle up. I want to back up a little bit because this campaign talks about transmission of HIV. And I think it's also useful to take a quick second to zoom out because people need to know, regardless of whether or not somebody is undetectable, the ways that HIV is not transmitted. Mm-hmm. You do not get HIV from hugging somebody who has HIV. You don't get it from sharing a drink with them or giving them a kiss, right? Like, these are not ways that HIV is transmitted, regardless of somebody's viral load. And for the people who are listening, viral load simply refers to the number of copies of the virus in a milliliter of somebody's blood. Just to keep it real here. So going more to your question, getting undetectable is what happens when the treatment you're taking, the medication you're taking for HIV, reduces the amount of virus in your bloodstream to a level that's so low that the tests that we have can't actually detect it anymore. Now, it used to be the case that when it came to HIV treatment, there were a whole bunch of things going against it. So number one, drugs were taken in fairly high doses, which meant that they were pretty tough on the body. Mm-hmm. Number two, we didn't really have the combinations of different classes of drugs being taken together. So that tended to mean that because you didn't have this sort of multi-layered treatment, it was more likely that you would develop mutations of the virus that were resistant to that type of treatment. And number three, what we had was a cost issue. Those treatments were not cheap. They're still not cheap, but you take those three things, and in a publicly funded system, the decision was taken that we're going to wait for someone's immune system to take a series of hits, and once their CD4 immune helper cell count fell to a certain level, that's when we would start them on treatment. Bit by bit over time, they started increasing that threshold, but there was always this lag between diagnosis and treatment. Finally, getting to the point, one of the things we discovered was that it was fairly likely that somebody who had a low or an undetectable viral load was at least less likely to transmit the virus. That's where we were a number of years back. So one of the treatment innovations that happened right here in Vancouver was called treatment as prevention. Let's get people on treatment right away because it's cheaper to treat them and have them not transmit the virus than treat downstream a whole bunch of other people. Now what has happened is we've had a bunch of studies, and they have studied well over 1 million sexual encounters, unprotected, between people who are serodiscordant couples. So what that means is one partner is HIV positive, the other partner is HIV negative, with the HIV positive partner being undetectable. So they studied all of these, and when they got to the end, they said, well, it turns out there was no transmission of the virus between the partners. They actually did find that there were a couple of HIV transmissions where the HIV negative partner became HIV positive, but when they looked at the genetic code of the virus, it didn't match their partner. They got it someplace else from somebody who likely wasn't on treatment, might not have known their status. What it means, all taken together, is that if you don't have a level of virus in your bloodstream that the tests can actually pick up, so if you are undetectable and you have been for at least 6 months, it is impossible to transmit the virus through sexual activity. Full stop.
Well, that's great, because I know that's a huge one. So that's great that they've made such an advancement
Huge advances,
in that. Yeah, that's
Oh
really
yeah,
great
and
to hear.
it's amazing, and it goes back, Sharon, to what you were talking about a little bit earlier on. You can have intimacy with your partner, regardless of what their status is. We now know that treatment is available here, and if people access it, that's all they have to do. They just have to access it, and they can live relatively normal lives. Now, there are some people, and we might get to it at some other point. There are people for whom accessing treatment may be a problem.
Yep.
Whether they're experiencing homelessness, for example, mental health issues, and things like that. We've really got to do better with them. Right now, I think our system is failing them, but there is a lot of good news.
And I think the key points you said, like the biggest awareness is U equals U, undetectable equals untransmittable, and also that HIV can't be passed on by a hug, a kiss, drinking someone's cup. Like, these are things that I feel in the South Asian community is still thought of. So
Yeah.
you're hitting all those scientific research and also the basic common knowledge that people should know. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and I really hope that for anybody within the community or anybody who's listening,
Yep.
if they have questions, if they're not sure about something, there are resources out there, and to go to trusted sources like katie.ca, for example, which is a great repository of information. Go seek those sources out because knowledge conquers fear.
Yes.
Yes, yeah. I like that line.
Knowledge conquers fear.
I'm glad that a lot of facts are getting put out there, and education as well. Every 2 hours, is it, somebody contracts HIV in Canada, which I was like, oh, smokes, that's a large number, right? There's like home test kits and so forth that people can get.
They're actually a fairly recent innovation. They got approved in Canada in November, I want to say, of 2020, and then provinces have been a little bit slow on the uptake. It usually takes a little while for something to go from the approval stage from Health Canada to actually seeing it rolled out by the provinces.
And does your organization supply those, or just out of curiosity?
We don't, but there are a number of organizations that do locally here in Vancouver and across Canada. They're now fairly easy to get those home test kits, but they're available through the Community-Based Research Center. That's at cbrc.net, through the I'm Ready initiative at readytoknow.ca. And for people in Ontario, from getakit.ca. And I'm sure we can provide you with those links so that you can put them up so that people can click them and find them more easily.
Perfect. Thanks for sharing that. Appreciate it. Sameer, we were both listening to a podcast earlier this month in regards to the legality and criminalization of, if you, let's say for instance, I have HIV and I have not told my partner that and they contract it. In Canada, I know in the U.S. that you are criminalized for that, right? And there's a lot of rules and stipulations against it and so forth. What are the rules here in Canada if that does happen? Or I guess even if it's undetectable and you find out later and tell your partner or whatnot, or who you've been with?
So, the law in Canada has kind of lagged behind science for a while. It's finally starting to catch up. So, back in 2012, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled on this issue. And what they said is that there's a duty to disclose if there is, and I'm going to quote here, a realistic possibility of transmission. What does that mean? So back in 2012, what the Supreme Court said is, hey, if you have a low or an undetectable viral load, so that's less than 200 copies of the virus per milliliter of blood, and in addition to that, you used a condom, you were good. You did not need to disclose. Now, they also suggested at the time that the way that standard is evaluated would be open to review as science advanced and as our knowledge advanced, which was good because, frankly, that ruling as it was written was unhelpful. So if we fast forward to 2017, the Department of Justice here in Canada said, here is some guidance based on where science is now. And what the Department of Justice has said is that if you are undetectable, then there is no realistic possibility of transmission. You do not have a legal obligation to disclose. If you do have a detectable viral load, but you either use a condom or engage in low-risk activities, let's just say, for example, only oral sex, there's not an obligation to disclose there. Now, if you're in a situation where you do have either other risk factors, and they're not terribly clear on what those are, but there are certain other STIs that you might have that make HIV transmission more likely. So if that's a situation or you're not on treatment, then you do have a legal obligation to disclose that to your partner.
Okay. I mean, that's really good to know. Good knowledge for anybody listening as well, right? Just out of, I mean, for me, we were just curious of what it was like in Canada, and just like the rules and regulations here as opposed to the U.S. But yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, if I would also add, I mean, so that's sort of where things are legally speaking, and honestly, the best thing you can do, and we'll talk about this a little bit as well. The best thing you can do is to know your status, because if you know your status, you can get yourself, in most cases, to undetectable, and life gets considerably easier in that respect, because you do have an absolute defense to anybody coming at you from a legal standpoint. From an ethical standpoint, it's also important for people to remember. I know a lot of people say, oh, ethically, morally, you always have a duty to disclose. Yeah. But that suggests that sex is planned, that there aren't power dynamics in play, and that life doesn't happen. And I think it's important for everybody to realize that given that we know that you equals you, there are sometimes situations, you meet someone at a bar, maybe things move really quick, maybe there's a little bit of alcohol involved. Somebody might not feel safe.
Right.
And if they're in a situation like that and they know that there isn't any risk at all of transmission, dumping that in their lap might make some people feel better, but it's not safe and it's not realistic. And we got to remember that there are two sides to an equation, and both people have a responsibility to do what's in their best interest to protect themselves.
100%. I do wonder why also like our healthcare system doesn't kind of put that in with, when people go to get tested for like an STI, STD, how come that one isn't just a part of it, if that makes sense? Given that now they're giving out test kits, I guess, for home use and so forth. But I do wonder why they haven't changed that, because it can be so undetectable within, folks in general. And it is something I think folks would want to know. I would want to know, of course, but if I'm going to get my regular, testing done, I would, now I know I'd want to get that tested as well.
Yeah, and I think the issue is that depending on where you go, whether you're getting testing, for example, through your doctor's office, where they might not have as much knowledge, versus going to a sexual health clinic where they might. I think the issue, you're absolutely right. The education on it is uneven at best. Yeah. And I think hopefully as we move past some of the stigma, we get better at educating.
Yeah. Because I think personally as well, like I couldn't imagine telling my doctor like I would like to have an HIV testing just because of like I have a brown doctor. I could just imagine. Neery knows my doctor stories, but there's just so much shame to even tell because like you can feel that judgment already coming through. So maybe let's jump into the HIV self-testing kits. And we were so surprised you can order it and it comes to your house. You can test. So can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so there's one test that is currently approved for at-home testing. It's called the Insti test kit. It's from a company called Biolytical. They are actually based right here in Richmond, so just next door, since we're recording here in Surrey. So it is a little testing well, and you take a finger prick of blood the same way that somebody who's testing blood sugar with diabetes, for example, would do. I promise it's not super ick. It's actually very easy to do. And then there's just a couple of vials of solution. They're all numbered in order, so it's really easy. You do this, pour it into vial number 1, use vial number 2, then vial number 3. Very easy. And in about 15 minutes, you have your results. Because it's an antibody-based test, though, I think it's important for people to know that it's only really fully like that 99% accuracy level. It goes back 12 weeks. So when you get your test, it's 99% accurate in terms of where you were 3 months ago. So for routine screening, it is a great tool, and I really recommend that people use it. If you are actually worried about a particular encounter, though, the one thing that I would sort of swerve off course a little bit here and say is go into a sexual health clinic and talk to a nurse, especially if it's within 72 hours of a potential exposure that you might be worried about, because there is something called post-exposure prophylaxis, or PEP. We talk about PrEP a lot, but PEP is what can prevent the virus from taking hold in the event that you have an exposure that you're worried about, but you got to do it quick.
Okay.
So awesome. You can just walk in within 72 hours. They can get that PEP test to know if they're concerned.
They can get, so it's full-on treatment.
Full-on treatment, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I'm just wondering, with the self-test kit you did at home, and then and then is it just dispose it after, like any other sort of, like a COVID test kind of thing? Like you just throw it out? You would just dispose of it. Okay. Many of the services that send them in the mail have an app that will provide access to some support services if you need them, where you can also record your results, and it's done very safely and confidentially. And then it's important, whether you get a negative result or a positive result from one of those, make sure you have somebody that you care about. They don't need to be in the room with you if you're not comfortable with that. Yeah. But before you're going to do that test, I would simply say, make sure that there is someone that you feel like you can talk to, whether that's someone in the healthcare system, whether that's a friend, whoever, because if you do get a positive result, it's important to make sure that you don't have to go through things alone.
100%. Yeah.
That's a very good point. Thank you.
Yeah, we had listened to another podcast as well. I'm going to kind of loop back to it. They were stating, the lady that was hosting it was talking to an HIV positive woman of South Asian descent. And she was stating that actually in the UK, the majority of folks in the UK that had HIV, I think, were of South Asian descent and women, which was also another eye-opener. But again, it's just not spoken of within our community. I've never had a conversation with anybody within our community about it. So again, I hope this brings some awareness and open up some people's mindsets to do what you got to do to get educated on it, and reach out even to the Friends Society as well if they wanted to learn more or volunteer or whatnot within that. Yeah, so I had a tidbit of information that I thought was quite interesting. And I was grateful that they had the podcast out as well. Do you remember the name of that one?
Yeah, Soul Sutras. Soul Sutras. Good episode.
Yeah.
Women talking awesome. About women.
I mean, that's awesome information. And yeah, I mean, I'll say I lived in the UK for a couple of years, and I volunteered for an HIV charity in the East Midlands. And the bulk of the people that I saw coming through the doors, at least in terms of people who were positive, were women. Many of them who had come either from South Asia or from parts of Africa.
Right.
So it's important to sort of think about this a little bit more globally. And yeah, so I hope that helps people realize that wherever they come from, whatever their background is, they're not alone.
Yeah, they're not alone. There's lots of support systems within this city as well, let alone I think globally, right? But I mean, I guess we want to touch upon like how would you say that we can support and embrace folks with HIV? How can we do better in supporting folks that are infected?
So I think, first of all, I'll say it's probably better to use terminology like living with rather than infected with.
Okay.
Just the words that we choose. And we may not mean anything by it. I certainly know that you didn't right there.
No.
However, sometimes just the choice of language we use will really affect how somebody feels being open around us. Number one. I think that things like this podcast right here are great because it allows people to get educated about something that they might not know about and, start to displace some of those stigmas. So I think that if people realize that people who are living with HIV are human beings who are entitled to love, compassion, and dignity, I think that if we all educate ourselves, whether it's doing this, accessing public health resources online, that's great. Go volunteer at a charity that does this. You will learn so much. And I think we should all remember that for most of us as adults, there's a saying, I guess, that goes, there but for the grace of God go I. It could be any of us.
Yeah.
And we should remember that and think about how we would all want to be treated if the roles were reversed.
100%.
Thank you. I think, just having this conversation, like we said, our intention was to start the dialogue within our friend circles, because anyone can be living with HIV and we might not be aware. So to hold a safe space is most important. And I think before we sign off, we just also wanted to touch on women. So we know women can live with HIV, are living with HIV, and how are they able to access resources here in Vancouver or Canada? Any support systems you can guide them to?
So the bad news right now is that there have been a number of women-focused services that unfortunately have had to close their doors. So there was the Positive Women's Network. I believe they lost their government funding for reasons that make no sense to me. And this was, I believe, back in 2017. There were other services through Positive Living BC, which unfortunately had to close its doors just around the start of this pandemic. And in fact, even within Friends for Life, we had a program called the Women's Wellness Initiative, and same deal, the funding stream from government for that went away, and we continue to look for ways of bringing it back. Now, that being said, the best place to start would be somewhere like the immunodeficiency clinic at St. Paul's, or a specialty clinic like Spectrum Health. And for something that is a little bit more women's focused, there is an HIV clinic at BC Women's Hospital in Vancouver. It is called the Oak Tree Clinic. And they are a great spot in terms of being super up to date on what the resources that are available. But then, the last thing I would say is with all of these services losing funding, it's up to us as engaged citizens to stand up and say that that's not okay, and to demand of government that they start providing funding for those supports.
100%. Yeah, I'm so taken aback that so many organizations have been closed down, or groups that have been closed down due to funding. But I get it. It's hard to get the funding and put in for those grants and so forth. But as long as we work together and get that sorted out, let's hope that there's going to be a change in the near future. And who knows, right? We have a sect in Sher Vancouver as well for HIV awareness and support. So
that's absolutely amazing. And what's great about that is there may be people who feel safe enough to be part of the Sher Vancouver community who might not yet feel ready to go looking for things in a more generalized space. So the fact that that's there, I think, is absolutely wonderful. So well done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Well, thank you so much, Sameer, for being on our podcast. And we wanted to also know, and maybe you can let some people know about the events coming up. I know you guys do bingo every Tuesday, and it's your 30th anniversary. And it's also his birthday, like we said earlier. But what other...
Yeah, we want to show up. We want to be engaged citizens. Tell us how we can do that.
All right, so with Friends for Life, first of all, volunteering, people are welcome to do any time, and they can pop onto our website, www.vancouverfriendsforlife.ca. There's a little link there to volunteer. We always love seeing people from the community helping out in that regard. In terms of events, like you already said, every single Tuesday at the Junction on Davie, 7 o'clock-ish p.m., we've got Bingo for Life, hosted by Connie Smudge. Who has also made the news
Yes.
lately,
Amazing.
spreading love and kindness. Beyond that, we have 2 galas planned this year, which is going to be great. The first one, Aurora, has been running for a couple of years now. It is a ton of fun. It's on the roof of the Vancouver Club. So it is, we've taken a venue that has been known for being less than supportive, and boy, oh boy, they have really, they've flung the doors open. They've been super supportive, and we've just got this great event on the rooftop with food, entertainment, live auction, silent auction, all sorts of, it's just a fun night. And then later on, stay tuned, in October, we will have a second gala that'll be celebrating our 30th anniversary. That will also be at the Vancouver Club, and it's going to be a ton of fun. I'm not going to take the wraps off of any of our secrets yet, but you don't want to miss it.
Perfect. Well, thanks for sharing all those awesome events.
We will be there.
Yes. Are we invited?
You
That's
are
the
so
real-
invited.
Yes, of course we are. Can you say the date for the rooftop one, the first one?
July the 10th.
July 10th.
All right.
Yeah.
People
Mark your
get
calendars.
yeah, mark your calendars. And every Tuesday as well.
Yes.
Every Tuesday.
So Sameer, we just observed the 34th annual World AIDS Day in December 1st. I remember I wore a red ribbon to work, and a lot of my colleagues didn't know what that was all about. So can you share a little bit of information about World AIDS Day and why that day goes so unnoticed for everyone?
So yeah, I mean, World AIDS Day started, I believe, in 1988. And it is a time for us to remember that this journey isn't over, to rededicate ourselves to advocacy in terms of making sure that governments are doing what they should be, and, to educate our friends and neighbors. Now, if you look back to the 1990s and the early 2000s, you would see red ribbons everywhere. Like, go back and look at the Academy Awards.
Really?
Yeah,
Wow.
they were all over the place. But it's also important to realize that back then people were dying left, right, and center from AIDS-related complications. Now, what's happened over time is that because HIV treatments have become better, we don't see people dying of AIDS the way that we saw them back then because there's less of it happening. And beyond that, I think it's important to remember that the people who do tend to die now of AIDS-related complications are the ones that society likes to forget. And so that's people who are experiencing homelessness, who are experiencing mental health, substance use, addiction issues, right? So when AIDS deaths now sort of happen to fall within this group that society tends, unfortunately, to ignore, things like World AIDS Day also falls off because in the eyes of some, the cause is, shall we say, less sexy. And so we pretend that it doesn't exist and that we can all just move on. I think it's really important to remember that just because we don't see it doesn't mean it isn't there. And just because the people who are dying live on the margins of society, it doesn't mean that their lives don't have value.
Yeah.
Of course, you can't disclose any information, but within the South Asian community, do you have folks attending Vancouver Friends for Life Society accessing these resources, or do you think there's still a long way for people living with HIV in the South Asian community?
I would say that the South Asian community does not appear to be accessing those services, and I can understand there are certain concerns about about what that might mean and what the impacts would be on, life and society and family in general.
Yeah.
But what I would also say is that organizations like ours take privacy and confidentiality very seriously.
Yeah.
And we also have that expectation of everybody accessing our services to be respectful of the privacy and confidentiality of others. So people really should not feel worried or concerned about accessing those services. It's really important that they actually do access those services for their own wellness.
Thank you for sharing that. I think, even with Sher Vancouver events, initially we had very low attendance. And I think because of privacy, confidentiality, people were nervous to attend. But I think with time and with this conversation today, we hope that people can attend Sher events and access different resources, knowing that their privacy, confidentiality will be protected.
Yeah, and even coming into the Friends Society as well to show up if they have any questions or concerns. I want to be a part of that, even in volunteer aspects of your guys' organization as well. So hopefully it opens up a gateway for folks to be able to come in and gain some knowledge and, participate in whatever it may be you guys are offering, right?
I really hope that people will use this as an opportunity to check us out, to access our services.
Yeah.
It's what we're here for. And if one person listening to this says, hey, this is something that I can access, then this is a huge win.
Yeah,
Yay.
100%. Yeah. One person at a time, right?
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Sameer, again, for being a part of the podcast today and also just sharing your knowledge and spreading the knowledge about HIV and how to support folks and also just bringing a limelight on HIV in general and us being able to share stories here and the support groups that are available through your society, the Friends Society, and actually all over BC, which is greatly appreciated. So thank you for doing that. And yeah, I hope everybody listening today is able to gain some awareness and want to even volunteer for the Friends Society or any other organization that's supporting folks with HIV. So thank you so much for listening. We're going to make it a wrap, and we're all going to say bye on 3. So 1, 2, 3.
Bye.